Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Jason Dawsey, Assistant Teaching Professor at Arizona State University and a faculty member in Arizona State's online master's program in World War II studies. This webinar today on Ukraine, the first of two webinars on the history of Ukraine, 1914 to 1945, thematizes questions of war, revolution, and genocide. And as part of a series we've been doing on Eastern Europe and World War II. The focus really today on Ukraine came about looking back on Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine and how the Vladimir Putin regime justified that invasion frequently by invoking the history and memory of the Eastern Front in World War II and the Holocaust. And so this has led to many calls for more attention to the history of Ukraine, to the history of that region. And so, with that in mind, we reached out to Professor John-Paul Himka for some expertise on the subject of Ukraine's history from 1914 to 1945. So, just a brief introduction for Professor Himka before we jump in to the subject matter. He is a retired professor of East European history, specializing in Ukraine. He taught at the University of Alberta for over 40 years and now concentrates on research and writing. His book, Ukrainian Nationalists and the Holocaust, and here is my copy of Professor Himka's book, was published in 2021. And he is currently working on the polarization of identity politics in independent Ukraine. So, John Paul, let me thank you right here at the outset for joining us today.
You're welcome. Or no
Great to
problem.
have you. Yeah, great to have you. It's a real delight for us to be able to do something with you. You were one of the very first people we thought about when we decided we need to do something about Ukraine, and the history is too complicated, too rich to even try to do in one webinar. That if you're going to deal with Ukraine during World War II, you needed to provide a deeper background on it, and so. Uh, we really appreciate you've taken the time to help talk us through some of this important history. So with that, John Paul, why don't we just jump in here? A series of questions. We're going to focus for our audience. We're going to focus on 1914 until the late 1920s in this first part. And then part two will go from the kind of beginning of the Stalin years, the late 1920s, early 30s, through World War II. So, with all of that said, maybe the understatement of the webinar will be that Ukraine has such a long, incredibly rich, and fascinating history, John Paul. So, what aspects of its politics, culture, and history prior to 1914, our real starting point, do you want to highlight for us?
Oh, before 1914. Well, the most of the Ukrainians were peasants, serfs actually, uh, totally disenfranchised in every way you could imagine, exploited, um, and they had a very small intelligentsia. And that small intelligentsia in the 19th century began doing all the things that small nation intelligentsias did. Recorded the folklore, the songs, the musical instruments, the dances, all those things. And eventually it went from being a kind of ethno-cultural project to a political project uh, where Ukrainians began to ask for um, equal rights with everybody else. And you have to understand that when we open up in 1914, most of Ukraine is in the Russian Empire, but a very important part of Ukraine is in under Austrian rule in the Habsburg monarchy. And in the Habsburg monarchy, there was a well developed Ukrainian movement that had education in the Ukrainian language. By contrast, in the Russian Empire, there was no education allowed in the Russian Empire in Ukrainian. In Austria, there was voting. Of course, in the Russian Empire, there was very late and very restricted voting. There were all kinds of organizations for the peasantry, which had been emancipated in 1848 in Austria. And there was very few even normal educational opportunities for the liberated serfs since 1861-64 in Ukraine. So there are two kind of centers, really, of Ukraine, intellectually, politically, culturally. The Austrian one, particularly the Austrian crown land of Galicia, and Ukraine within the Russian Empire, which did not have a designation such as Ukraine or anything like that.
This is so helpful. There's so much there to say, but that definitely, I think, highlights for us the fact that Ukraine, there is obviously division in terms of where Ukrainians are at. They're in two different empires, and we're the period we're talking about here. And those empires are obviously they're on a collision course. More on that here in just a second. But there is also the basis for a kind of national consciousness, which you're noting as well, prior to 1914. And we'll have plenty more to say about the growth of Ukrainian nationalism in this webinar in the second. So, with that background out of the way, I think we can now kind of move into really the focus of the webinar, kind of 1914 to the late 20s. And that takes us into what historian Eric Hobsbawm has called the Age of Catastrophe. This period stretching from 1914 to 1945. So that takes us into World War One. And this is, I think, something, John Paul, for a lot of our audience may be really unfamiliar. Is that what did the onset of war in 1914 with the Russian Empire siding with the Western Allies, with Britain and France against Austria-Hungary? You mentioned the Crown Land of Galicia, siding with Germany, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria. What did this mean? What did the onset of war in 1914 mean for Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I want to emphasize what incredible destruction it brought. In the World War One, the Russians came went west, and in the beginning of the war, they took Galicia and the Ukrainian territories of the Austrian Empire. Then they were kicked out by the Austrians and Germans all the way out of Ukraine. And eventually then there was a fight for the rest of Ukraine later, so that armies were traversing back and forth across the country. And for Ukrainians in particular, since they were peasants, since they were liberated serfs, they had um, very little means. So many houses were destroyed as a result of the war. So many horses requisitioned, that would normally be used for plowing. So many young people dying in this war. And so that's the first thing I would say, that it was incredibly destructive. I mean, we live in North America. I'm in Canada, you're in the United States. We don't know anything about that. We haven't seen anything like that since the Civil War a long time ago. But this was an area which starts that way in 1914 with all this bloodshed, destruction, economic collapse. And then I have to also say that it was a time of a lot of internally displaced persons. People don't realize that. There's an excellent book called A Whole Empire Walking about World War One and the Russian Empire. And I've read memoirs about it. And the imperial government wanted everybody to move away from the front, particularly Jews and Germans who they suspected might collaborate with the enemy, but also just the ordinary people. And I know this not only from all my reading, but my mother-in-law, my late mother-in-law, she was a toddler basically, and she had to follow her family from where they lived near Grodno all the way pretty far east. So that it was a lot of people were displaced, IDPs. Then they were eventually, after the war, able in most cases to come back to where they had been. The other thing about war that I want to say that's very important: guns, lots of guns. Different situation than, let's say, today's war in Ukraine. Today's war in Ukraine is mainly fought with drones, aircraft, bombs, those kinds of things. But World War I was fought with rifles primarily, individual soldiers. And that meant that a huge number of young men had combat experience. And as the Russian army, which was the weakest of the armies in many ways, it was the most illiterate, it was the most poorly supplied army. As it began to crumble in the face of the German advance, and as it began to crumble after years of war weariness, and as it began to crumble under the impact of the Bolsheviks, who were telling people to stop fighting, take your guns, go home. What that did is that in the former Russian Empire part of Ukraine, there were all these armed young men in their 20s with guns. A lot of them went home and they settled issues, and not just issues that we know in the big history, which is that they went and they joined the Bolsheviks or they joined the Petliurists. Not just that, village would fight village over forests, over access to forests, over access to meadows. So it was a very dangerous situation, I would say, World War One. And I think those are the main points I would like to point out about the war itself, until we get to the disintegration of the army and the beginning of the revolutionary era, which starts in the Russian Empire in February 1917, and in the Austrian Habsburg monarchy as of November of 1918.
Thank you. Yeah, you've really set me up already, John-Paul, with the next question, because here you pointing to how destabilizing for Ukrainian society the war was, the carnage wrought by the war itself, and then just the effects it's having on social life with all of the kind of influx of guns and ammunition and a kind of brutalization. I think you're pointing to that is happening there, and obviously what we're about to get into is an intense politicization of Ukrainian life. Not that there wasn't politics happening already, but it's about to amp up in a dramatic way in 1917, and that's really taking us into this epochal year of revolution. So this next question starts with the February Revolution of 1917. It brings about the overthrow of the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty in the Russian Empire. You get this provisional government created that's still continuing to prosecute a deeply unpopular war. And then the establishment of this Petrograd Soviet of workers and soldiers deputies. um, Leon Trotsky, as you know, John-Paul, from Ukraine, will use this famous phrase "dual power," where you have the Petrograd Soviet and the provisional government now. Nicholas II has been toppled. So this is quite a situation that you have in place in the Russian Empire. What this is going to mean not only for the Russian Empire, but what it's going to mean for Europe, what it's going to mean really for the world. We'll obviously have some things to say about that shortly, but let's keep the focus here. What did the February Revolution mean for Ukraine?
Well, the February Revolution, like you say, there were the Soviets and there was a provisional government. So the Ukrainians also had a Soviet, a national Soviet. It's called the Central Rada. Rada in Ukrainian is exactly the same as the Russian word Soviet. Um, and so the Ukrainians organized this Central Soviet or Central Rada, which the Bolsheviks for a while also, cooperated with as one of the Soviets, as one of the voices of the people. But and this I would say is a key factor to understand that the Ukrainians were totally unable uh, intellectually and materially to adequately respond to the situation that had been created. So they were both a Soviet and they had relations with the provisional government. The relations with the provisional government are very interesting to me. Uh, the Ukrainian Central Rada was looking to have some kind of autonomy within Russia, within the Russian Empire, within was now no longer an empire, but within democratic Russia as it emerged. And they worked very closely with the provisional government. And working very closely with the provisional government meant that they also were expected to contribute to World War One. That is, to send their forces against the Germans and the Austrians. And this was a problem. There were no Ukrainian units within the Russian Imperial Army at all. But the Central Rada began asking Ukrainians from the armed forces, from the Russian army, to form separate units, the Botan Khmelnytsky unit and a number of other units. And they used those units. They sent them off to the front, or they tried to send them off to the front. But nobody wanted to go to the front after February 1917. And so, but that's still what they tried to do. And that caused resistance from what little armed forces what they had. The other thing about Ukraine, when I say that it didn't understand the situation, at least the Central Rada didn't, they kept negotiating with the provisional government for recognition. And in fact, as I point out in one of my articles, they sent negotiators to Petrograd to negotiate with the provisional government at the very moment when the Bolsheviks were launching their October uprising. So they were totally out of it, totally not realizing the revolutionary situation. If you read the memoirs of Volodymyr Vinnichenko, who was really the head of the government, uh, he says things like, it was we had to do our own sweeping in our offices. We had to do our own typing. We didn't really have a staff. We were waiting for funds from the provisional government. Totally missing the fact that in a revolutionary situation, you don't wait for permission from some other body. You just take what you need. They didn't have that understanding that this was no longer an ordinary bourgeois society, or it was about not to become an ordinary bourgeois society. So that was a real problem that they had because they didn't grasp the moment. And I mean, mind you, the Bolsheviks had really good leadership. They knew they were looking for a revolutionary situation. They'd been thinking about a revolutionary situation, and they did everything in their power to intensify the collapse of the empire and to bring it to a really revolutionary situation. So the Central Rada didn't understand that at all. Moreover, a problem with the Central Rada was that it called various congresses, soldiers' congress, various kinds of professions, congresses. But these congresses were just sort of volunteer individuals coming together. Yes, I'm a soldier and I'm pro-Ukrainian. I'm going to the Congress, or you know, and in that kind of situation where it was based on individuals with an awakening of tenderness, let's say, to Ukraine, which is the phrase of the time, the awakening of tenderness. But the problem with that is they didn't base on existing organizations. They're because of the nature of the Tsarist regime, you did not have many societies, associations. You didn't have much freedom of the press, and people were entering a new world, especially the peasants who had been in the army. They picked up stuff in the army, but it wasn't as if they were organized. So by contrast, in Galicia, in the Austrian half of the monarchy, I mean, in the Austrian half of Ukraine, which is actually not a half, but something like a quarter, there were organizations. This had been the way the Ukrainian national leadership built the Ukrainian movement in Galicia and, for that matter, Bukovina, is that they created fire brigades in the villages, reading clubs where peasants, even illiterate peasants, could go and they would have newspapers read aloud to them. There were sobriety organizations. There were numerous organizations, and when the peasants joined these organizations, not only did their educational level rise, their political consciousness rose, but they were already members of units bigger than themselves. All this was absent in atomized Russian Ukraine. So, although the Central Rada had impressive congresses, they didn't have enough of an infrastructure to do much. They had a government, but it was very weak. They had armed forces, but they were very weak. The armed forces didn't want to fight. Nobody wanted to fight. So I would say that when the October Revolution comes, when the Bolsheviks take power, they just have no understanding of what happened. To them, the Bolshevik Revolution was this chaotic moment. They couldn't believe it happened. This is not unusual. A lot of people believe that. A lot of people believe these were just extremists who would never get anywhere. So they certainly misjudged the Bolsheviks. They would say they would wanted to be in federation with democratic Russia, but that they weren't ready to join with these chaotic people. So they missed because they didn't have any revolutionary thinking. They were, and some of their leaders had spent most of their time in Austria anyways, like Mikhailo Hrushevsky, the president of the Central Rada. He was used to, going to cafes, talking to people, voting in elections, having a nice university position where he taught Ukrainian history, blah, blah, blah. These were people who were like from another world from the world that was being created at that moment, the revolutionary world that was going to just be in constant combat, really, for years to come after World War I. I mean, I would say Ukraine, things don't settle down there till maybe the end of 1920. So they have like six years of war. So that kind of puts them in a very subservient position, or not somewhat subservient because they don't really know who to answer to. They're looking for allies. They're looking for maybe France to help them or somebody, but the West at this time wonders whether these Ukrainian governments are Bolsheviks themselves. They don't know anything, and they certainly have people who are denouncing them. So they missed the point, and 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 they have to ally ultimately with the Germans. Um, so
Yeah, we're gonna get to that too, Paul. Just to jump in here because there's so many things to kind of keep separated for I think our audience, and I think you've really given us a great overview of um, this moment between February and October 1917. It seems so brief, really, when you think about it. You're talking whatever 7 to 8 months or something, but it's so dense. There's so much happening there, and you're pointing to how to many of these Ukrainian elites um, that on the one hand, February opens up all these possibilities, like for a federation with Russia, for much greater autonomy, yet the war is still going on. And you have this issue now about um, the Bolshevik Revolution, which hits this whole area, if not the world, like an earthquake. And so that takes me into this next question about October 1917, Vladimir Lenin leading the Bolsheviks. He had come back to Russia, Petrograd. I should have mentioned for maybe our audience not familiar with that, had been St. Petersburg until renamed during the war. But Lenin had come to Petrograd in April 1917 after being in exile in Switzerland and quickly begins to organize this revolutionary Marxist party. It's been around for years, but he really does kind of organize it as with a program. John-Paul, for you, this will be nothing surprising. I think it's good for our audience to remember they have 3 to 4 demands that they put out there, which is that the Bolsheviks say we stand for all power to the Soviets, all sovereignty to the Soviets. These councils, the provisional government is a treacherous bourgeois imperialist government. It will undercut the popular aims of the revolution every time it has a chance. It will continue this war, right? So that's part of it. They talk about peace, land, and bread. And that's so much just packed in there. An end of the war, land reform, people will be able to have food, to be able to survive. Given the situations there, they talk about workers' control of production. That's a very kind of open end. Like, what does that really mean at the moment? But the Bolsheviks will talk about that at some real length. And they have, is what we're about to get into here, they have a lot to say to the issue of oppressed nationalities in the former Russian Empire. So they take power, John Paul, as we all know, in Petrograd and Moscow first, these uprisings there, and then it spreads, and you had this new Soviet government. First, the Bolsheviks, and then they're joined for a period by uh, the left wing of the Social Revolutionary Party that spoke for the peasantry in the empire. Doesn't last very long, but there is a coalition government there. They recognized Poland and independence. Both part had been part of the Russian Empire. So this, anyway, is a long way of saying, John Paul, how does Ukraine figure in Bolshevik thinking about what was called at the time the nationalities question?
okay, I'll answer that, but I just want to go back. You mentioned the land issue, and that is absolutely characteristic of the moment. The Ukrainian Central Rada also wanted land reform, and but it would have to wait until after the Constituent Assembly was elected, and there would be legislation about land reform and compensation to landlords, etc. And the Bolsheviks told the peasants, "You want land? Just take it. You got guns, you can take it." Okay, now, yeah. So I went back to that, and let's see, where were we? We were. What
Oh,
was the question?
the
Oh,
nationalities
the national.
question and the Bolsheviks.
Yes, the Bolsheviks had um, the most, I would say, quite open policies on nationalities. The provisional government was very slow to give any recognition whatsoever of Ukrainians, uh, which is why the Central Rada uh, was constantly negotiating with them. But the Bolsheviks, in fact, Lenin told Stalin early on, before all this happened, to figure out what is our position, and it was it should be national rights, and even to the point of secession if necessary. So that was their program, and it was attractive to some people indeed. But in the actual moments of the revolution, there wasn't a lot of attention paid to it. Um, the Bolsheviks in December of 1917 formed their own Ukrainian government, and the capital was in Kharkov in Russian, and they set up a rival government of Ukraine. There were Bolsheviks such as Shakrai and Mazak who were for an independent Ukraine, communist Ukraine, Bolshevik Ukraine. But the ultimate arbiter of this whole situation was Lenin, because lots of the left communists like Katkov and others were looking to carve Ukraine up into industrial regions, the Donbass, the central wheat growing areas, based on economic principles. But Lenin, particularly when all was said and done, and he'd seen how long the Ukrainians had been fighting for some kind of separate existence, he was the one who, and Putin is actually correct on this, who decided that there should be a Ukrainian republic, and and the borders of Ukraine that we have today are basically, well, expanded by Stalin, but a lot of those borders were settled by Lenin's design of where Ukraine was. So they had an attractive program, but the actual policies sometimes were quite different than what Lenin was saying. So when the Bolsheviks would take a place, they weren't always, no, put it, that's, I'm underestimating. Um, Very often when the Bolsheviks took a town, they would switch everything to, Russia and persecute the Ukrainian activists, that kind of thing, because they were the enemies. But generally, when you look at it from the top point of view, Lenin felt you had to recognize the aspirations of Ukrainians. That's why there was a republic, which, as I say, is still the foundation of the statehood, which later became the independent Ukraine.
That's really great that you explained the reference. I was going to bring that up, that Putin had made this comment a few years ago that Lenin is really the father of Ukraine, of independent Ukraine, obviously in saying that in a very critical, negative way. And I think for especially a lot of Americans had no idea what was meant by that. So you explained what the reference was, what Putin was recalling, and something he obviously condemned, but Lenin's own thinking about um, the status of Ukraine, what it would be with this new revolution and new Soviet republic whose shape is still unclear yet, as the revolution is still in its early phases and a civil war building on the horizon. But one of the things, John Paul, we just noted was the Bolsheviks were absolutely opposed to continuation of the war. Lenin had described it as a predatory imperialist war that really was about partitioning the world between the big capitalist states. So the Bolsheviks do begin to negotiate right away with the Central Powers, particularly with Germany, obviously. And Trotsky is at this point the Commissar of Foreign Affairs. And what comes out of that is this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 that the Soviet government signs with Germany and the Central Powers. It's just worth noting for our audience right here. I noted many people are not aware of that, there was a coalition government there, the Bolsheviks and these left social revolutionaries, usually referred to as the SRs, left SRs. This peace treaty is so controversial that Lenin signs that it ends the coalition government. The left SRs pull out of the coalition, and eventually hostilities begin with the Bolsheviks. But that's another story. What I wanted to ask you about here, John Paul, is just very directly like, what did the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk entail for Ukraine?
Okay, first of all, I think you might be aware there were two treaties of Brest-Litovsk. The first ones to have a treaty of Brest-Litovsk were the Ukrainians. So here's what happened. In December of 1917, as I said, the Bolsheviks had founded a rival Ukrainian government, and that was because they saw that the Ukrainian government was not willing to, or the Ukrainian Central Rada was not willing to join the Bolsheviks, that they were actually letting the Don Cossacks go through their territory to form an anti-Bolshevik alliance, an army. So as of December 1917, Ukraine and the Ukrainian Central Rada and the Bolsheviks were at war. The Ukrainians held out for a while, but by January 22nd, 23rd, 24th, in that area, the January 20s of 1917, the Bolsheviks were about to take Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. And in that situation, for the first time in this whole revolutionary era, Ukraine decided to declare independence. And they did that on the 25th of January. They backdated it to the 22nd of January. And for years, we in the diaspora, I'm Ukrainian myself, we would celebrate 22nd of January as Ukrainian Independence Day. Now we celebrate 24th August. But under the cannon fire, the artillery could be heard in the Central Rada offices in January 1918. So in that moment, they declare independence of Ukraine. And I should say that immediately afterwards, Hrushevsky, the leader of the Central Rada, says that this is a temporary measure. We prefer federalism with a democratic Russia, not an independent Ukraine. But why did they declare independence? Because they wanted to sign a peace treaty, a separate peace treaty at Brest-Litovsk with the Germans and Austrians. And they do that. So what that results for Ukraine is that the Germans come in and the Austrians, but the Germans are the major forces. They come into Ukraine and they kick the Bolsheviks right out of Kyiv and other places with the German army. And so the result is that Ukraine is dominated by Germany. They set up a different government because the Central Rada is they feel is, well, not only just too democratic but too ineffectual. That's been proved by everything they had done earlier. They're not an effectual force. So he puts Pavlo Skoropadsky, the hetmanate. It's a hereditary position at one time, or a position that uh, wasn't so much hereditary. Certain families, the Skoropadskys had been hetmans of Ukraine, some of them, in the Cossack times. Anyways, Skoropadsky is a Tsarist general. He knows what a firm hand is. He's not he's Ukrainian, but he's also quite open to Russian influences. Uh, he's the Germans want him to collect food because they're overstretched. Their home front needs to be fed. Ukraine is the breadbasket. It's got all this food there. Uh, and all kinds of Russians come from the imperial parts that are occupied now by the Bolsheviks, and they become like the ministers of posts, and they take the various positions because they've got actual experience. Few Ukrainians had actual experience in government, um, so particularly not the kind of Ukrainians that were in the Rada. So at this time, a lot of rather, they're noble Russians. They're parts of the old imperial system come to Kiev and try to run the country. Vinichenko, the Ukrainian president, just before he was kicked out, he referred to this as gathering up the Petersburg garbage, the Petrograd garbage, because all these officials were coming down looking for a cozy place to get a salary. Uh, and But that wasn't such a bad thing. Although in the end it meant that Skoropadsky, before he totally got overthrown, made a pretty much a pro-Russian, of course, pro-white Russian government. But what really happened is this: Germans wanted food, and the Bolsheviks also wanted food, but the Germans, in particular, wanted to export. They had all kinds of agreements with the Central Rada and then with the Hetmanate government, for eggs, wheat, all the rich agricultural produce of that country of Ukraine. Well, it was before collectivization. There was a lot of the agriculture was subsistence agriculture of peasants. Landlords were fleeing, and the peasants would divide up the land among themselves, or and so forth. And of course, I'd already described the economic consequences of World War I in these regions. So they were not doing very well, these people, all the peasants. And how do you extract food from individual peasant households? Well, the only way to do it is to requisition it. And you requisition it, and it's a really slow process. Eventually, I would say that when you look at collectivization in 28, that's an answer to the problem of how do you extract food from a peasantry. So the result was that the Bolsheviks lost a lot of support when they were trying to get food, but the Germans, who not only just wanted to feed their army but also wanted to feed the home front, caused a real conflagration in the countryside. Warlords appeared. Machno, the anarchist, appeared, and these were people who fought the Germans, protected their protected protected the peasantry against the depredations of the collectors of grain. And actually, Ukraine was in flames. It was a really violent in the countryside. Skoropadsky really couldn't deal with it. Uh, and all these warlords appeared also because they had all, as I said, they had all these guns they had brought home. Not everybody who brought home guns were necessarily Bolsheviks. These warlords would switch allegiances right and left all the time, adding, of course, to the stability of Ukraine. Uh, so, so Skoropadsky managed to stay in power only because he had the German backing. But when Germany and Austria were defeated in November of 1918, uh, that government collapsed. There was an uprising by the Ukrainian forces, by the pro-Ukrainian forces, the democratic ones that had been in the Central Rada, and they reorganized an army under Pedlura. And
This is so helpful, John Paul. I'm glad you're here to kind of take us through this history. I think for our viewers can just see how complicated this is and so many different phases to go through. And you've already noted here about there's these who's in power. We've had already now multiple governments, in power, and the Germans there. And then defeat in the war for Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Central Powers, and revolution in the cases of Germany, Austria-Hungary, all of them undergo revolutions. And 1918, 19, that just transformed this whole situation. And I want to kind of come back to the carnage you noted that's been unleashed here, and really had been going on since the beginning of World War One, and is often overlooked. You've already made a few allusions to later history, whether it's Stalin and collectivization. I think for people who are interested in World War II in Ukraine and know something about the brutality of the German occupation in Ukraine then, but know very little about the German presence there during World War One, that you also have this anti-Semitic violence in Ukraine. It's not the only place in the former Russian Empire where you see this, but certainly one of the more extreme cases. Terrible pogroms, violence against Jews and their property in early 1918. And then to quote Brendan McGeever, in fact brought his book here for those who might be interested, an excellent book called Anti-Semitism and the Russian Revolution. He talks about this anti-Semitic violence reaching a devastating peak in 1919 and lasting well into the 20s. So, John Paul, could you talk with us a bit about these pogroms, and how much responsibility for these massacres do you attribute? You've already mentioned him already, so now is an opportunity to talk about him some more. Certainly one of the most contentious, controversial figures in this period's history, the Ukrainian nationalist Shimon Petlura, as well as the white, and I'm using the term white for our audience, counter-revolutionary General Anton Denikin. Both of them are present in Ukraine at this time after the Germans are done. And what's going to happen now that the Central Powers are defeated? What's going to happen? What's the future of Ukraine? Could you say something about this?
yes, I will, because it's quite germane to an understanding of a lot of things. So the Pedlura army um, really was very much like the kind of organizations the Central Rada had. Uh, individuals would join, some of the warlords would join. There was a group called the Free Cossacks who were like richer landowner peasants who would join. But it was a real kind of free for all about who would be in Petliura's army. At one point, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in 1919 commented that, you know, the soldiers all show up for their pay, but they don't show up for battle. And the pogroms, we already have in this time, and it actually is there's an earlier kind of identification in Europe, Eastern Europe in particular, of Jews and socialism. I've written about that, but in 1919, a lot of the soldiers believe that the Jews are all Bolsheviks and communists, which is absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. But of course, you know, there was a lot of propaganda. Trotsky was a very visible figure, and he was often in posters, anti-revolutionary posters with exaggerated and demonic Jewish features. So that was one thing. It was kind of an ideology, but these are kids in their 20s with guns, and they're absolutely can do anything they want with impunity. And normally, the pogroms before they were getting more violent over time. But by you know, so the first pogroms were in 1881, 82, and then there was another wave during the 1903 to say 1905, and then all of a sudden, mainly in 1919. But you're right, it starts in 1918. Mainly in 1919, it's just a massive phenomenon. There's a really good book by Weidlinger called it's called something like "This Is Also Europe" or something like that, which goes into these pogroms in quite a bit of gruesome detail. But the 1919 pogroms had numerous fatalities. So some of it is ideological, but not I don't think really very much, because these are not, you can look at them, they're not very sophisticated people, but some of the officers have you know, very strong anti-Semitic views. But just, you know, and these are armies that are not getting well supplied. But if you took over a large Jewish grocery, you could feed an army for quite a while. There was, I don't know if you've ever read Quiet Flows to Dawn by Mikhail Sholokhov, but it shows the delight soldiers take in executing people, cutting off their heads and doing things like that. And these are undisciplined soldiers. So they kill the Pedluris forces, or allied to Pedluris, kill about 50,000 Jews in 1919 in horrible places like in Proskuriv and elsewhere. Horrible pogroms, not just murder, but dismemberment and all sorts of things. That actually is fairly normal in these kind of situations, dismemberment. But they account for about half the 100,000 victims that are Jewish victims that die as the fatalities from the pogroms. Denikin, the White Army, probably maybe about 30%, maybe a little bit less, maybe 25. And all kinds of independent warlords were involved in this. You know, I think that Jews made really good targets for a peasant army, because a peasant army doesn't have goods, and Jews who were very much in mercantile professions. A lot of them were craftsmen as well. Uh, they had things that the army wanted or that the peasants wanted. So they just killed and robbed. And I think that that probably accounts for more than any ideological anti-Semitism in this mix for the Pedluras. Pedlura himself was no anti-Semite, but he had an army. That army fed itself partly by requisitioning and killing the Jews. So he didn't distance himself as much as he should have from these things. It was very late that he took any measures to try to stop the pogroms. Yeah, so that's what I would say about that. And even some Bolsheviks did it because if when you look at all these people who are fighting, these kids, because they're basically like I say, about 20 years old, maybe even a bit younger. They got guns. They don't have a really highly developed moral compass by this point. They've seen war. They've been killing for quite a while. Uh, they they're just let loose on this population, and they steal and they kill and they rape, of course, lots of sexual assault in these situations. And it wasn't just the Ukrainians; it was also the Don Cossacks and other formations. So it's a very very sad time, and it really makes a lot of Jews want to leave that country.
It's worth noting here that I mentioned McGeever and that he points to the fact, as you just said, that they were members of the Red Army that now led by Trotsky as Commissar of War that are involved in this violence against Jews. And it gets to such a point that there are a number of Jewish radicals that are allied with the Bolsheviks at this time who just demand of Lenin that he do something about the killing. And he ends up issuing this decree which orders summary execution of pogromists and of people who are inciting, even if they don't take part directly in the violence, of inciting people to carry out violence against Jews. It just shows you the level at which this reached in 1918, 1919. And this, I think, also should be pointed out here for our audience, John Paul, that Petlura, you noted, in fact, that he's a much more kind of ambivalent figure in this regarding his views on anti-Semitism and the like, even though there are people under his command or associated with him get caught up in this violence that he's assassinated in 1926 by a Ukrainian Jewish anarchist named Schwarzbard in Paris over this, in fact, violence several years later. Just noting our time here, and there's a few other kind of things I want to get to before we wrap up with this first part, John Paul. And maybe speaking of wrapping up, which just to wrap up for our audience, the Civil War, we can talk about a few things after that. But I think for a lot of people might want to know how, because it wasn't a foregone conclusion, but how did the Bolsheviks end up prevailing in Ukraine? And one name that comes up when you're looking at the Bolsheviks in Ukraine at this time is Christian Rakovsky. And what would you want people to know about Rakovsky? Why was he a significant figure during this period?
He was actually a Bulgarian, but actually many kind of identities he had. During the revolution, he was not very pro-Ukrainian. He was ruthless. But later, after Stalin came to power, he wrote a whole series of things about how important it is to respect the Ukrainians' rights. But I really have to finish just a little bit about the
Please.
revolution and the pogroms, because in November of 1918, as I said, there's an uprising against Skoropadsky because Germany is defeated. In Austrian Galicia, in November, when Germany and Austria are about to be defeated on the 1st of November, the Ukrainians in Lviv and Galicia formed the Ukrainian Galician Army, and they formed the West Ukrainian People's Republic. They start a revolution against the Poles. They fight the Poles valiantly, I would say. My Galician pride coming out here. They fight the Poles, but they're defeated not by the local Poles that they're fighting, but by an Haller's army. This was an army that was trained in France to fight the Bolsheviks. And then the French said, okay, go ahead and fight the Ukrainians. And when Haller's army came in and pushed the Ukrainians out, in June of 1919, they joined with the Petliura forces. And they were just horrified by what they saw. Um, and they did an investigation into the big Proskuriv pogrom. They were just horrified by the undisciplined troops that Petliura had at his command. So I want to, and they marched together with Petliura on Kyiv. They get there, they take it for one day. Denikin comes from another direction, drives them out. Um, so and the Ukrainians then, the Petliuras make an alliance with Poland, and they march back in 1920.
It's just remarkable keeping up with all of these different aspects and alike. But you've helped us, I think, sort out a lot of that. So, did you want to say something by way of kind of wrapping up? We still have a couple of other questions post Civil War, but about why the Bolsheviks were successful
Oh,
in taking Ukraine ultimately.
they had a hell of a time. They had a hell of a time because nobody wanted to fight. The Bolsheviks had been got where they were by telling people to uh, go home with their guns, and people were weary, and they weren't necessarily going to fight anything. The way they did it really was that there was an army, there was a Bolshevik army that was put together by Trotsky, right, the Red Army, but it was very weak. And in Ukraine, what the Bolsheviks did was they just urged the peasants to take the land and kind of used their uprisings, the peasant uprisings, which they instigated, to move the the others out. But Denikin was a tough nut to crack.
Yes. Yeah, he was such a formidable figure. And I think that does take me into maybe this is I think another angle to approach about Bolshevik triumph. They have a figure you've already mentioned him who is a sometime ally. He's a sometime adversary, and that's Nestor Makhno, the Ukrainian anarchist. Um, a really remarkable, fascinating figure, John Paul, and you've alluded to him and things you've written. He may be really not very well known, I think, to much of our viewership. What would you want people to know about Makhno and the role he plays here in how the Civil War progresses in Ukraine?
He was from Eastern Ukraine. He was a worker, a Russian-speaking worker, and he also went to war, and he learned how to do things. And he was very bright in many ways. He was the one who invented Tachanka, which is basically a cart with machine guns on it. Um, and he tried to institute an anarchist. I don't know, what anarchists have countries or what. Anyways, he tried to have an anarchist um, rule in areas he controlled. His troops were fairly disciplined, but they also occasionally went into the Jewish pogroms, like is normal, and much they targeted very many of the German colonists. who lived in Ukraine, particularly the Mennonites. And the Mennonites suffered tremendously at the hands of Makhno. He had a bit of a pro-Ukrainian, in a sense of national profile, and after his defeat, he wrote a book in which he says that he didn't pay enough attention to the Ukrainian question, and he's sorry he never learned to speak Ukrainian. So he has inflamed the imagination of a lot of people. He's considered a figure to some extent of kind of as a modern day Cossack, not like a Don Cossack, but like those Cossacks of the 17th century.
It's his ability to kind of sow kind of havoc in Denikin's lines as Denikin's trying to advance against the Red Army, and Makhno would his ability to disrupt things in the kind of rear areas. And that people always will bring this up. John Paul, like he was very innovative. He certainly could be ruthless, but was very innovative, and definitely had this vision. I mean, it's interesting that Trotsky later, after he's expelled from the Soviet Union, after the clashes with Stalin, will claim, and Victor Serge, one of his supporters, will echo this, that he and Lenin had talked about once Denikin and the whites were crushed in Ukraine, should there be some talk about an area in Ukraine that would be set aside for Makhno and the anarchists. Now,
Wow.
why that didn't happen? I mean, obviously there were pro-Bolsheviks that blamed it on Makhno. Uh, People who sided with Makhno said this is Bolshevik treachery. Anyway, there was a long and fractious history about who was to blame for that, but at times they did work together. At times they fought one another. Even though you're talking about revolutionary Marxists and anarchists, that's hardly new that even though they may be on the same side against a common enemy, working together was simply just did not happen in the long term. So it is a fascinating history, and people continue to be interested in the case of Makhno. So I'm glad you had a chance to talk about, him some there. And that takes us into the kind of early 20s, John Paul. I mean, we're kind of now in this 1920 period, 21 period. And I think for our viewership who already may feel like, wow, we have done a lot in this webinar. There's been a lot of layers to this. There's another layer, which is this war that breaks out between Poland, newly reconstituted from Imperial Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, now reconstituted. It has a war with the Soviet government in 1920, and certainly Ukraine is caught up in that. What would you want us to know about where Ukraine fits in the history of this war?
Well, when the war was on many fronts. Tukhachevsky was coming to Warsaw, but managed to be stopped, and but the Poles were also hoping to go into Ukraine. This was also territory that they thought would be useful to reconstitute something larger than a mere Poland, kind of revival of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with different nationalities and historical places where Poland had once been the ruler. So Kiev, for instance, Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, at first it was part of Kievan Rus, then it was a Mongol principality, but from about maybe 1400, 1500 until 1686, I would say, was under Polish rule, and Kiev remained a Polish city for a long time. It was a major language in the city late into the 19th century. But so he was kind of following a two-pronged program there. One was pushing back of the Soviets, and number two was having a Ukraine that having a Poland that also included parts of Ukraine that were traditionally Polish territories. And after the war and the peace treaty, the remnants of the Petliura government and the Petliura army were stationed in Warsaw, and they worked closely with the Pilsudski government. So it was an interlude that because Ukrainian forces were in deep despair by the end of 1919. They were crowded in a small little area. They had a typhus epidemic. Some of their troops had even deserted to the Bolsheviks. And Petliura signed a peace treaty with Poland in September 1919, which the Galicians from Austria, or the former Austria, absolutely hated. But Petliura thought, I'll make an alliance with Poland, and that's why they visited Kyiv again in 1920.
That's stunning, really. This history, and there are many people who remember today the Poles stopping the Red Army outside of Warsaw. You know,
Yes,
the miracle on the Vistula,
right.
um, and that they saved Europe from communism or Bolshevism. This became a big part in terms of Polish, history. But I think, as you're pointing out, John-Paul, Poland had clear designs on Ukraine and on this territory in this area too, and that can't be excluded when one is looking at this conflict and how it began. So that leads to the final question for today. And again, we appreciate your time in this, and there will be a part two that will pick up from the 1920s forward. But I thought I would conclude here with something after this period of war that goes on from 1914 to 1921. It's something you've written about that hasn't really gotten sufficient attention, I think, in the Anglophone world, especially for people who are rightly interested in what Stalin does in Ukraine. And that's what you term Ukrainization that occurred in Ukraine under Bolshevik rule in the 1920s. So, could you talk about what this was, John-Paul? What was Ukrainization, and why should we be aware of this?
Well, this is part of a general Bolshevik policy um, of indigenization, that is to bring the non-Russian peoples into politics, more recruitment to the Communist Party, flourishing of culture. Uh, this was a general policy that went beyond Ukraine. But in Ukraine, it was one of the most interesting intellectually periods of Ukrainian history, because Brushevsky, who had been the president of the Central Rada, returned to Soviet Ukraine. So did others, and they put out journals, formed, built up an Academy of Sciences, which had already been founded earlier, Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. Literature was, it's, very experimental. Most of the literature of that period, I can't stand to read, but that's my literary tastes. It's very avant-garde, and dance, theater. Uh, for me, the scholarly production of this era was just fantastic. From my first book and my dissertation, I relied a lot on the publications of that era, where they looked at the late 19th century and so on. And there were Ukrainian leaders that were very prominent. So Mykola Skripnik was the Minister of Education and moved things further along. Was he Minister of Education? But anyways, he was, and the officials had to take courses in the Ukrainian language. There was unbelievable film. Dziga Vertov was making films in Ukraine at that time. That's, a man with the camera, for instance. So it was a real flourishing, a boom of Ukrainianists. Meantime, though, the former Galicia, which had been in Austria, was now in Poland. And there they couldn't enter government. It was their access to even education was denied to most Ukrainians there. The Ukrainian school system, which had flourished under Austria, was essentially shut down. So a lot of intellectuals went from Galicia to work in Soviet Ukraine. And this also produced a tremendous Sovietophile in Galicia. So this was a real high point in Ukrainian cultural development. And most of these people, many of these people were later killed. We'll come back to that next time. But it's important to understand that this was quite the experiment. There's a book by Terry Martin called Affirmative Action Empire, which goes through the kind of indigenization program throughout the Soviet Union. But for Ukrainians, it's very, except for the independence, which occurred in 1991, I can't remember a time in history that was as productive culturally and intellectually as the 1920s, a period of Ukrainianization.
It is really astounding to see the kind of open, creative um, side of social cultural life in this period for someone who's I remember seeing Ziga Vertov's The Man with the Movie Camera when I was in graduate school and just being kind of stunned by this. And for our audience, it's just should point out this is happening overlapping with the new economic policy
Yes.
that Lenin adopted in 1921 after the Civil War was over, moving away from war communism and requisitioning. And so even like markets are permitted to some limited degree, right? And so peasant agriculture in places like Ukraine, there's some attempt to really kind of bounce back after all of this bloodshed and devastation. So it is a remarkable moment, and it will make the Stalin years all the more painful to confront, knowing what Stalin ended. That there was this moment in the 1920s in Ukraine, and we'll take up the story of Joseph Stalin, um, the horrendous policies, criminal policies enacted there in the 1930s, and then into World War II with Nazi Germany's invasion of Ukraine in part two. But for right now, John Paul, let me thank you. It's been a great conversation. I think you shed a lot of light on so many complicated aspects of this history from 1914 in the late 1920s, and we look forward to part two. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're certainly welcome. I hope it was okay.